Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive where we really dig into the research you give
That's
us.
right.
And today is no exception.
No.
We're tackling a really big one this time.
Yeah, this is a big one.
The Old South.
Yeah.
You sent over this fascinating chapter called Cotton, Slavery in the Old South. And
It's a good one.
it's a good one. Yeah.
Packed with a lot.
Yeah. It's really eye-opening stuff. And one of the things that really jumped out at us was this statistic about cotton.
Oh, yeah.
By the time the Civil War rolled around,
Oh, yeah.
cotton was 67%
Huge.
of all U.S. exports.
It's massive.
I mean, can you imagine
I have to-
two-thirds
Yeah.
of everything America was selling to the world was just cotton?
That's what put the U.S. on the map economically. I mean, think about it. That single crop, for all the good and bad that came with it, it really did put them on the map.
Yeah, I mean, that is staggering when you think about it. But the chapter goes on to really talk about the darker side of this economic boom, and that's really what we want to unpack today.
Yeah, there's no getting around that.
So let's start with how this whole cotton kingdom got started.
Okay.
The chapter talks about a big shift in economic power from the Upper South to the Lower South.
Right.
What caused that?
Well, the Upper South had been all about tobacco for a long time.
Right.
But tobacco had its problems. Prices were unstable.
Sure.
And it really depleted the soil.
Love to grow.
And then in the coastal areas, you had rice and sugar.
Okay.
But those were super labor intensive,
Right.
and they had their own challenges. So
Neither of those were really panning out
not really.
as that reliable moneymaker that they had hoped for.
Exactly.
And so that's where cotton comes in, right?
Yeah, so cotton was already around, short staple cotton,
Okay.
but it was really hard to process because of all the seeds.
Oh, yeah.
But then enters the cotton gin. Total game changer. All of a sudden, separating the seeds from the fiber was easy,
Okay.
and short staple cotton just took off.
So cotton gin equals boom.
Yeah.
And that's when things start to take a turn, right?
Unfortunately. Yeah,
Yeah.
the Lower South had the perfect climate and land for this kind of cotton.
Right. Perfect growing conditions.
So you have all of these people flooding in, wealthy planters looking for land, smaller farmers hoping to get rich.
Yeah, land grab.
But they all needed labor.
Right.
And that's where things get really dark.
Yeah, and the chapter really doesn't shy away from this either. I mean, hundreds of thousands of enslaved people
Yeah.
were forced to move to these new cotton states.
Right.
Either they were sold outright or just marched south, ripped away from their families.
Yeah, it was awful. They call it the second middle passage in the chapter. It's chilling, really.
Right.
Just like the original slave ships' families, torn apart, people treated like objects,
Commodities, yeah.
all to make money.
It's heartbreaking to even think about.
It is.
And then you've got the Upper South where tobacco had been king,
Right.
but now they're struggling.
Mm-hmm.
But they actually find a way to profit from this whole situation.
Yeah, it's pretty grim. They started selling enslaved people to these cotton plantations down south.
Wow. So the solution to their economic woes was to literally sell other human beings.
Sadly, yeah.
So you have this massive cotton economy just exploding, bringing in all this wealth.
Yeah.
But did that lead to more development in the South?
You'd think so, right?
Yeah, you would think.
But not really. There was some growth in certain industries like flour milling, textiles, iron manufacturing,
Okay.
especially in the Upper South. But it was nothing compared to agriculture.
Right.
In 1860, Southern textile manufacturers were worth about $4.5 million.
Okay.
Cotton exports $200 million.
Wow.
It shows you just how much they were relying on that one crop.
That's a huge difference.
Yeah,
So cotton is king, but what about all the other things you need for a good economy?
right.
Banking, transportation, were those up to par?
Yeah. Not so much. The non-farm commercial sector was basically there to prop up the plantations.
Okay.
Banks were mostly in cities, so rural areas were kind of left behind. And transportation, well, let's just say it wasn't great. A few roads were terrible, and the railroads were a mess.
In a logistical nightmare.
Pretty much, they relied heavily on steamboats and other watercraft to move everything around.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how this lack of development might make them more reliant on the North.
Oh, absolutely. They needed the North for manufactured goods, for merchants, even for professional services.
So it's this imbalance between the two.
Yeah, a big one.
Okay, so we've got this picture of a society that's completely tied to cotton behind the times in terms of industry and really leaning on the North for a lot of its basic needs.
Right.
But what about the people themselves, the white Southerners? How do they justify building their wealth and their whole culture on the backs of enslaved people.
Well, you have to remember that the dominant narrative in the South at that time was that slavery was a good thing, that it was a benevolent institution, and that Black people were inherently inferior and unfit for freedom.
So this idea that slavery was actually helping Black people.
Yeah, it's a completely twisted logic, of course,
Yeah.
but it was deeply ingrained in their society.
Yeah. And how many people actually bought into this?
It was pretty widespread in 1860. 25% of white families in the South owned slaves.
Wow, a quarter of the population.
Yeah, and in the lower South, where cotton was king, that number was even higher.
Okay.
And these were the people in charge, the planters. They held all the political power, and they were fiercely protective of both slavery and the cotton economy that depended on it.
Right. So they were really doubling down on this system.
Definitely.
Okay, so the economy, the culture, the politics, everything revolves around slavery.
Mm-hmm.
But I think a lot of people have this image of Southern planters as these kind of laid-back aristocrats
I know what you mean.
sipping mint juleps on their huge plantations.
Yeah, the stereotypical Southern gentleman.
Exactly. It's the chapter back that up.
Actually, it paints a very different picture. It says most planters were working incredibly hard.
Really?
Yeah, they were constantly buying and selling enslaved people, figuring out transportation, dealing with market swings, just trying to squeeze out every bit of profit they could.
So not exactly relaxing on the veranda.
No, not at all.
More like running a corporation.
Yeah, exactly. And most of their wealth was tied up in land and enslaved people.
Right. So not necessarily liquid.
Exactly. So they weren't rolling in cash for personal luxuries or anything like that.
Interesting.
And they often had to move to find better land for cotton.
Okay, so they're on the move.
Yeah, it was all about maximizing profits.
So much for the Southern gentleman myth.
Right.
But not everyone was a plantation owner.
Of course not.
What about the rest of white society in the South?
Well, there were a few different layers below the planter class. You had a growing middle class in the towns and cities.
Okay.
Merchants, shop owners, lawyers. They might own a few slaves, but nowhere near as many as the planters.
Okay, a different scale. And outside the cities, what about the people in the more rural areas?
There you had farmers working smaller plots of land.
Okay.
They might have some enslaved workers, but their main focus was on growing crops to sell.
Gotcha.
But compared to the planter class, they had limited opportunities for education and social advancement.
Right, so stuck in the middle.
Kind of, yeah, not quite elite, but definitely benefiting from the system.
And then, of course, you have the people at the very bottom.
Yeah, sadly, there were a lot of poor white Southerners who didn't own any slaves and often lived within the plantation system reliant on the local elites.
So dependent on the wealthy.
Exactly. They dealt with things like malnutrition and disease, basically living in poverty.
And they're in the same society that's saying slavery's good for everybody.
Yeah, it's a real contradiction.
Did they buy into the whole pro-slavery ideology?
It's interesting, their support for slavery was actually kind of mixed. Some of them saw right through it.
Okay.
They realized it only benefited the rich.
Right.
But others held tight to this idea of racial supremacy.
Even though they were struggling themselves.
Exactly. They saw themselves as better than Black people, regardless of their own circumstances.
It's kind of a classic example of how racism can divide and control people,
It is.
even when they're struggling.
Absolutely.
So we've talked about cotton driving the economy, the horrors of the slave trade, and the different levels of white Southern society. But it's important to highlight how unusual slavery was in the South at this point in history.
Definitely.
The chapter calls it the peculiar institution.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's for good reason, because by the mid-19th century, most of the Western world had abolished slavery.
Right.
The South was one of the few places where it not only continued, but it was thriving.
Exactly. It's kind of mind-boggling when you think about it.
Yeah, you have this nation striving for freedom and equality.
Mm-hmm.
And then right in the middle of it, you have this system of oppression just chugging along.
It's a huge disconnect between the South and the rest of American society.
Culturally and morally.
Yeah, a gap that seemed impossible to bridge.
And that isolation probably made it easier to justify what they were doing.
Oh, absolutely. When you shut out outside perspectives and critical thinking, it becomes easier to hold on to even the most horrific practices.
And slavery's impact went way beyond economics.
Oh, for sure.
It shaped everything in the South.
Everything.
It fueled this hatred and mistrust between whites and blacks.
Yeah.
It impacted families, religion, education, politics.
It was everywhere.
And ultimately, wasn't this desire to protect slavery a major reason why the South fought the Civil War?
According to the chapter, yes, they were willing to go to war to defend a system that had become so intertwined with their identity and way of life.
It's a chilling thought
It is.
that so much bloodshed stemmed from this commitment to such an inhumane system.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get into the actual rules that governed slavery, the Southern slave codes, and what were those like?
These codes were all about controlling every single aspect of an enslaved person's life. They couldn't own anything, they couldn't move around freely, they couldn't meet in groups, they couldn't have weapons, they couldn't defend themselves against violence, and they couldn't even learn to read or write.
It's like a complete system of oppression.
Yeah, it was designed to instill fear and obedience.
And how did they enforce all of this?
Well, the punishments were incredibly harsh.
Okay.
Think about this. Killing a slave by their owner wasn't even considered a crime.
Wow.
And enslaved people faced the death penalty for killing or resisting a white person, or even suggesting a revolt.
So the scales of justice were definitely not balanced.
Not even close.
And on top of that, you have the everyday violence.
Yeah, whippings, beatings, branding were all commonplace.
So just constant brutality.
Yeah, the punishments were swift and severe, often carried out by the slaveholders themselves.
It was a reign of terror.
Yeah, you could say that.
So we're getting a sense of the laws and social norms that kept the system in place.
right.
But what about the actual lives of enslaved people? What were their living conditions like?
For most enslaved people who lived on mid-size or large plantations, the conditions were awful.
Okay.
Their diets were minimal things like cornmeal, salt, pork molasses.
Just enough to survive.
Basically, yeah. They wore flimsy clothes and lived in rough cabins that offered little protection from the elements.
Just the bare minimum.
Yeah, and even basic medical care was usually provided by enslaved women who had to rely on traditional remedies and whatever limited resources they could find.
So they were left to fend for themselves, essentially.
In many ways, yes.
And what about the work itself?
It was backbreaking. They were forced to work from sunrise to sunset, doing grueling labor in harsh conditions.
Yeah.
On smaller plantations, they might also do domestic chores in addition to field work.
Okay, so a variety of tasks.
Yeah, and on larger plantations, they often had designated domestic staff.
So even within slavery, there were different roles.
Right.
But I imagine domestic work wasn't a picnic either.
No, it came with its own set of hardships. Domestic staff often faced isolation, lack of privacy, and constant scrutiny.
So a different kind of pressure.
Absolutely, and Black women in particular were incredibly vulnerable to sexual abuse by their owners and overseers.
That's horrific.
It was a truly terrible situation with no escape.
So we see this constant exploitation and abuse.
Yeah, it's a dark chapter.
But amidst all of this suffering, there were glimmers of hope.
Mm-hmm.
What about the free Black population in the South? How did that even work?
Well, there were free Black communities throughout the South.
Okay.
By the Civil War, over 250,000 free Bactrial Black people lived in slaveholding states.
And where were most of them concentrated?
More than half were in Virginia and Maryland.
Okay, so mostly in the Upper South.
Yeah.
But how did people gain their freedom in a system that was designed to keep them enslaved?
There were a few ways. Some earned enough money to buy their freedom.
Okay.
Often after years of backbreaking work, others were freed through the wills of their owners.
Okay.
Though laws in the 1830s made this harder.
So it became even more difficult to gain freedom.
Yeah, it was always this precarious thing.
It could be taken away at any moment.
Exactly.
What was life like for free Black people in the South?
It was a constant battle. They faced discrimination, prejudice, and threats to their safety.
So living under a cloud.
Yeah. The shadow of slavery created this intense fear and uncertainty. But despite all that, there were free Black communities, especially in cities like New Orleans and Charleston.
Okay, so some semblance of community.
Yeah, and some even became wealthy and prominent.
Wow.
And in a cruel twist, some even owned slaves themselves.
Wait, Black people owning slaves, that's kind of hard to wrap my head around.
It is a complicated situation, but the key takeaway is that even though most free Black people lived in poverty, they still overwhelmingly chose freedom over slavery.
Yeah, I can see why.
The desire for liberty and self-determination was just that strong.
It's pretty powerful.
It is.
So in the midst of all this oppression, how did Black people maintain their identity and their sense of community? What kept them going?
Well, they developed their own distinct culture as a way to maintain their pride and unity and hope.
Okay.
And religion played a huge role in that.
Right, religion has always been a cornerstone of African-American history.
Exactly. By the early 19th century, many enslaved Black people had converted to Christianity.
Okay.
But it's important to understand that they didn't just passively accept the religion that was forced upon them.
Right.
They blended it with their own traditions and beliefs, creating a unique version of Christianity that emphasized themes of freedom and deliverance.
So it was about taking something that was imposed on them and making it their own.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
It was about finding strength and hope in their faith, even under the most oppressive conditions.
And their religious gatherings were more than just about prayer and singing hymns.
Oh, yeah. They were chances to connect, build community, share stories and traditions.
What a real sense of belonging.
Yeah, they were affirming their humanity and heritage, carving out spaces for their own cultural identity, even within the confines of slavery.
So even in that system, they found ways to express themselves.
They did.
Were there other examples of that beyond religion?
Oh, definitely. Music, storytelling, dance, all those art forms were important.
Okay.
They provided comfort, inspiration, and connection.
Right?
It was a way to preserve their heritage and fight back against the dehumanizing aspects of slavery.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can find a way to create beauty and meaning.
Absolutely.
Speaking of resilience, we have to talk about family and how enslaved people managed to maintain those bonds in a system designed to rip families apart.
Yeah, the strength of family ties among enslaved people is really remarkable.
It is.
They faced constant threats of separation, but they found ways to nurture love, create traditions, and pass on their heritage.
And how did family structures look different in this context?
Well, Black women started having children younger, and premarital pregnancy wasn't condemned like it was in white society.
Okay, so a different set of values.
Right, and couples often have formal marriage ceremonies even though their unions weren't legally recognized.
So they created their own structures.
Yeah, they did what they could to create stability and meaning in a system that was designed to deny them those things.
And it must have been so hard to keep those bonds strong.
It was the fear of being separated from your loved ones was a constant weight on their shoulders.
Right, the constant threat of being torn apart.
Yeah, children sold away from their parents, husbands from wives, siblings from each other. It's just unimaginable.
It really is just heartbreaking.
It is.
But even in those awful situations, enslaved people found ways to cherish their time together.
Mm-hmm.
They shared stories, traditions,
Yeah.
and instilled a sense of pride and a yearning for freedom in their children.
Those bonds were powerful.
It's amazing how they managed to keep those connections alive,
It is.
even when the system was working so hard to break them.
It speaks volumes about their love and commitment to each other.
Yeah, so as hard as the institution of slavery tried to destroy families, it couldn't crush that love and loyalty.
Absolutely not.
But those family and community ties also played a role in resistance, right?
They did.
Running away wasn't always just about escaping to the north.
Right.
Sometimes it was about reuniting with loved ones who'd been sold.
Exactly.
And the Underground Railroad also played a crucial role in helping families reconnect after being separated.
It did.
So it adds a whole other layer to the motivations behind resistance.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about individual freedom. It was about protecting the people they loved most.
Exactly.
And all of this is happening against a backdrop of larger social and political turmoil.
Mm-hmm.
Tensions over slavery must have been incredibly high at this point.
Oh, absolutely. By the mid-1800s, the U.S. was like a powder keg ready to explode.
Yeah, just waiting for a spark.
The abolitionist movement was gaining traction in the North, challenging the morality and legality of slavery.
Okay.
Well, pro-slavery forces in the South were digging in their heels, ready to defend their way of life at any cost.
So this is setting the stage for a major showdown.
Yeah, it was a fundamental clash about the very core of American society.
And every aspect of American life was becoming more and more divided over this issue.
Absolutely, from politics and economics to culture and everyday life, the debate over slavery was inescapable.
Well, that's about it for our deep dive into cotton, slavery, and the Old South.
It's been a powerful journey.
It really has.
A lot to think about.
And it's a reminder that this history isn't just something that happened in the past. It still shapes our world today.
Absolutely.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking.
It's been great discussing this with you.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep the conversation going.